Welcome to another Britflicks.com podcast. My name's Stuart Wright, and today's guest, all the way from 13 hours away in New Zealand, is James Ashcroft. Welcome to the show.
Kia ora, Stuart. Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about your film, Coming Home in the Dark, which is available in the UK on Netflix. I presume it's available in other places on the same platform, or is it other platforms?
Netflix, yes, we're a global Netflix.
Brilliant. So before we go into details about how you made that film, do you want to give people a brief synopsis of how you would describe the film?
Yeah, I personally describe it as it's a perfect family outing that gets interrupted by two men with a rifle and turns into a road trip from hell, which sees this perfect urbane family really have to look and explore who they are, and the past is never done with us.
No. As Mandrake says, it's a small country.
He's not the only one who's ever said that about New Zealand. I think that's quite a common phrase. But yeah, it's a small country.
No, I just like that idea of summing up the nightmare that's happening, and he's like quite matter of fact about it. You know, the chances were great, mate. You know, but we'll try our best to, for the listeners' benefit who might not have seen the film, to stray away from too many spoilers, because I must admit I went in freezing cold when I went to see it. I just like the smell of it when I saw it come up on my list, and I'm like, and then it started and I was in. So I know what it was like to feel the layer of the onions come back. So inevitably, maybe later on in the conversation, we might dip into some specific details, but I'll try my best to not be spoilery. And I've watched it a couple of times, so I am familiar with its backwards and forwards. So I might use words like the problem or the event, and I'll assume you know what I mean. I was reading about the sort of shaming of childhood care in New Zealand, which was a news story that ran during 2021, because I think there must have been a big court case that came through. 250,000 children out of 650,000 that had been in care were viewed to have been abused in some way, shape, or form. But obviously, that news broke after you've made your film, or certainly after you've started developing your film. So, for you, where does the idea, the concept, and the idea that started in your head that became the film that we can see now on Netflix?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really comes from, I think, two sources. One is obviously inspiration from the short story Coming Home by Owen Marshall, but I say inspiration rather than adaptation, because that short story is really only like the first 20 minutes of the film. And in many ways, you know, I loved Eli Kent, who co-wrote the project with me. We loved the story, we loved the tone, we loved the sketch of those characters and setting, and the idea that, you know, extreme violence can also be found in the most beautiful and picturesque places in our country. But it, you know, as a piece in of itself, we had seen that film before. We'd seen that film done really well by other people. So we knew we had to try and find a way to get underneath that short story, to have it speak to something more personal and bigger, contemporary. So we sort of set it aside for a while, and we worked on a number of other projects. But I've always had an interest in that world of the boys' homes or the child welfare, and that massive failing that it has had, not only in New Zealand but in most. I mean,
it's a first world shame everywhere you look. I think, to be honest with you, there's stories in most first world countries of how care of poor and vulnerable people was just given to sadists and predators.
Yeah, and there's many layers to that failing too, which, you know, I really found out from speaking and interviewing and becoming friends with a number of people who had gone through that system. I had one of my brothers. He had a brief stint in that. He actually had a very good time there. So he was one of the lucky few. But I produced a documentary a few years back, which was very, very small documentary that looked at a very specific boys' home in New Zealand. And one of the things that, and this was sort of known as one of the worst, it's constantly referenced, and the Royal Commission, which is the thing that's just come about in recent times, which is giving us those factual numbers and impacts of what that failing of state care did. And by doing that documentary, that was a great sort of eye-opener and put me in touch with a lot of not only former residents, but also some of the former housemasters and teachers there. And what I found really fascinating at the core of it, other than this, how the long shadow of abuse still affects many of its survivors, and my absolute admiration that these people are still standing and fighting, is also that, on the flip side, you have people who who taught at places like this, or who were staff at places, and some of these people were great. They were real humanitarians, really, really focused on doing something positive for you. But there's another side, which is, this need for staff, untrained, given no support. They may very well have gone in there with best intentions, but in a pretty, toxic culture and environment where violence was encouraged, it was just about control and getting these kids to do as they're told, that becomes quite a corrosive and corrupting thing, which which is, I think we're all susceptible to in a different environment. So I make the distinction there, because obviously these environments too attracted predators. The sharks go to where the school of fish are, and so it did attract some very horrible people who never had good intentions in mind. But I did get very interested in that dilemma of a good person going in to do positive things for kids, but finding themselves trapped and affected. And it doesn't, it doesn't take long before, your environment starts to affect and shape you, for a number of reasons. Fear can be a huge thing, trying to fit in, trying to do your best, or doing what others around you do. So I got interested in the flip side of those men who found themselves in that position, but also it didn't take too long before they started using their fists and thumping children. Because at the same time, you've got, with a lot of former residents, those who have dabbled in crime throughout their lives, there's no black and white on either side.
No.
So it's just still this question about this, how everyone is still living in the shadow cast by these state-run institutions. So, and it's timely that, things like the Royal Commission in New Zealand are now, concluding and starting to acknowledge the failings of these former residents.
So once you've got sort of your head around the sort of macro issues of it, obviously you've got to make a drama. You've got to turn that into a personal story with real stakes for the individuals concerned. So what were the challenges then for you when, sorry, I forgot his name now, sorry. You and Eli, in terms of making that into a screenplay that could be the film?
Yeah, I think overall the biggest challenge, which, continued to be even after we'd finished it, was steering away from any temptation to black and white the characters. So, so from treating one as a villain and one as a hero, these terms, protagonist, antagonist. Now, don't get me wrong, Mandrake does some pretty unforgivable things to which he, in this film, which he should be held accountable for. That's different. When we talk about these two men at the center of it, we wanted to sort of go, well, how do we not let the audience off being able to go, oh, good, I can sort of distance myself from that character and say they're good or they're bad. And that was something we were very clear on from the outset, of not trying to, let the audience off the hook in any way when it comes to these characters. And we wanted those allegiances to be sort of shifting and fluctuating.
Yeah, because I could imagine it could have been really easy to make Jill the moral center of this film, where all good emanates, kind of thing.
And she's, obviously she's in many ways the most empathetic and sympathetic character because of who she is as a person, but also what she goes through and the decisions she makes there. But it was very much, we had her, but to one side of Hoagie, but it's also about going, seeing his character unfold through her eyes and going, well, what does that really mean for us as an audience too? And how does that inform how we feel about both Mandrake and Hoagie and Tubbs as well?
I'm guessing, did you have the sort of the end in sight from the get-go? Obviously, Mandrake's identity and Hoagie's identity is clear from the moment the film starts, isn't it? From your point of view, we don't know as the audience. That's that relationship or that understanding of what's really going on is what you begin to reveal. So for Jill, she's like the audience in a way, isn't she?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's why we sort of say we kind of have to we begin to understand who her husband really is through her eyes, and that was always something we were very clear on because a lot of residents at a lot of these boys' homes, they often had nicknames. Some of the teachers and the housemasters had nicknames, and in many cases, that the nickname endures into life. And I like the idea of, as an adult man, you stay the way you look. Essentially, you're always going to be a version of that. But a 10-year-old, there's a big difference between a 10-year-old boy and a 30-year-old man that they become. And I like the idea of, not this guy not being able to recognize who his, aggressor is, and that slowly starts to unfold for him. But also the idea that it's, Mandrake's forgotten who this man is until he hears his nickname, and then that all comes back, and that felt very real and grounded to me. That sense of we choose to remember or retain knowledge accordingly, and it's often interesting how those little details then open up big sparks into our memory banks. Because one of the things we always, from a distributor's point of view, we had a number of distributors going, this needs to be, these guys need to be hunting the family. They need to be like serial killers. And we weren't very interested in that sort of dynamic because, it feels much more grounded. As we were saying before, this is a small country. And Mandrake says, where do you think we go? This idea that, beautiful spots in New Zealand, all around the country, you have to share it with everyone, and good things and bad things happen in these places. The land remains indifferent, but New Zealand is the whenua, the land, actually belongs to everyone, and what comes from it has to be acknowledged equally.
Yeah, it's almost like from an anti-heroic point of view, what we see happen is Mandrake's manifest destiny. It's like the drifting was his mission, although he probably didn't know it consciously until the spark happens. His mission was to do this. It might not have been that particular man, but it was going to be a man connected with that part of his life that he could then almost like, it's a bit like an adoptive child finding their real parents. It's almost like that missing connection in terms of who you are as an adult.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, actually. Because for Mandrake and Tubbs, this is, I think he says later in the film, this is just another car we needed, another meal, this is, and we open with the abandoned car at the side of the road, giving an idea of like, this is this is who the last meal ticket was. This is just sort of how these guys are living their lives in this very brutal fashion. But yes, it is a thing of, the past does catch up with you for both Mandrake and for Hoagie, and this inevitability of we'll meet again.
I mean, if I'm going to go back to when I watched it the first time and just think, and when I watched it the first time, and I'll use the expression, the first two violent events that happen that get us going, and then we're driving down a darkened road. I'm like, where the hell's he going to go now? He's spent all his money. He spent all his money on the story. Where can the story go from here? Like, coming to it cold. You're just like, I'm used, I've watched enough horror films and I'm like, well, two drifters and something violent after that. That usually at least midway we're going to get there. But forget us over that line within 10, 15 minutes. I'm like, my goodness, hold on to your seats. Like, I mean, you really did take the carpet from under the audience, I felt.
Even now, it's one of the first things whenever anyone says, I saw your film. It's like I'm going, in the back of my mind, I'm trying to stop myself from asking them, like, oh, did you keep watching after minute 16? It's it was always a bold card to play. It was in the short story. So, and to be honest, like initially when we first started scripting, Eli and I, we looked at every possibility of how to get around that moment, how to cheat that moment. I think at one stage we were going, well, maybe it's maybe they're Hoagie's parents, elderly parents, because it's all right to shoot the elderly and not or anything. Get rid of them. But it was a moment we were going like, this is going to be, this is a moment where the audience is either going to hunker down or they're going to opt out. And I'm a father myself, so I'm aware of what the ask is. But, when we really came down to it, it was about going, from this point, all bets are off. And the sooner we can get into this being the catalyst for what we want to say, which is really the meat of it, we can't fully go there unless we do this.
I would compare it to, like, say, how Kiss Me Deadly starts, with the barefooted woman. It's like, where the hell am I? What's the film doing to me?
And I mean, when thematically for us, that was the main point of going like, no, we feel comfortable and clear about what the intention is here, because what we are talking about, with not to be too spoilery, is thematically we're talking about the death of children in some way, shape, or form. Spiritually, mentally, emotionally, we're talking about broken children. And I always think, actually, Mandrake and Tubbs, in one sense, I mean, these are two children who died. These are two men who died in their childhood, essentially.
They've been surviving since 10 years old, haven't they, really?
Yeah. Once we were, made that decision and that clarity, as I say, it was actually very easy then to move on and incorporate events. I mean, there was always, sort of a sense of, a lot of people, I think it's quite divisive in that way. I think some people really lean into it, and other people sort of expect there to be, a continual topping of events or violence and things like that. But, and that's why, Jill does what she does. There is there's no greater fear for a parent. And no, and there's no coming back from.
No, and also you make it without even knowing what's going on. For Mandrake and Jill, it is only ever life and death from that point on. These people can behave in such cold, logistical ways in terms of acting with violence, that you're just needing to work out how and when you can get away if that ever happens. And that's not going to be something you have to plan and strategize. It's going to be, the stakes are that high, we're going to take a chance kind of thing.
And also about, like, how do you arrest people, truly arrest them and get them engaged in this very sort of, we think of I always thought of the car as like a pressure cooker. How do we create such pressure and put these characters under such duress that it gets to a boiling point, and that's when it explodes onto the landscape. And there's these moments where steam is let out, escape attempts are made, and then how do we get them back in this sort of endless nightmare of this car travelling through the deserted countryside of New Zealand at night. There is literally nowhere to run.
Yes, that was the bit that for all of the claustrophobia in the car, the minute they were out of the car, they were like rabbits in headlights all the time, because there wasn't anywhere, you couldn't knock on someone's door because you're in the middle of nowhere. You weren't going to happen upon someone because it's an empty rural road at the God knows what hour at night. And you felt that really. So there was that inescapableness of it. And like I say, with the high stakes you'd already set with that opening salvo, I was gripping the arms of my seat, so I was in. Mandrake is he's almost like sophisticated in his psychopathy, I think, is probably a fair way to describe him, because he's kind of measured, and yet he's not afraid to do the dirty work at the same time. So he can have a wonderful conversation with you, and you can feel like you're talking to someone that is being reasonable, and then you'll see the evidence of your eyes that there's not a reasonable bone in his body if he wants his own way. How did you and Eli sort of fight with that one? The idea of a man with such shark-like purpose, but actually quite enthralling.
Eli and I come from acting backgrounds. We come from the theatre, and we both spent a lot of time on the boards here in New Zealand. So the way we usually write is, when we get together in this little office here, is that we sort of get to a point, once we've got a shape of the whole and who these men are, kind of wear them like suits a bit. We always end up, sort of falling into characters. I always seem to end up the sadistic character, and poor Eli's this is nothing indicative of our relationship as writer-director. But we try and sniff them out, I think, with an actor's nose, and also the idea of, pursuing, well, what would be great to do in a moment like this. So, and that can be really helpful just in terms of challenging ourselves and each other on perceptions or judgments that might start to creep in around a character. I mean, part of what's great about Owen's story is that he gives you this great sketch of Mandrake, which is about sort of challenging your perceptions of what you think, criminality is, or that people can't be civil, people can't be erudite and loquacious. This is, and for us, it was always with Mandrake. It's always, but what's fueling all of that is it's a demonstration for him. It's like him flexing his muscles in a pub, when he's getting the feeling that someone's going to challenge him to a fight. It's that idea of going, I can take you on in this way. Obviously, the greater you push, the more you push, and Hoagie does, down the track, is that you start to realize that is posturing. It is surface level. But he's been able to, he's somebody who's clearly has an aptitude, an interest in knowledge and words as weapons. I suspect he learned over the years, everything being fueled and weaponized is how I think of Mandrake. And I think, that makes for a really nice contrast to, say, just the look of the man who you first meet. And I think that's really important with, in both respects to him and Hoagie as well. Because, part of the reason why we cast Eric Thompson as Hoagie is that Eric's sort of like the good father and husband of New Zealand and Australia. He's done a lot of television here where he is affable, lovable, good man. And cast him because A, he's a great actor, but B, it's like if Eric had done anything like Hoagie had done, I would have felt a deep sense of disappointment in the man because he reflects such a strong warmth and righteousness there. He's got such a an open and warm quality and a humanity to him. So I'd be deeply disappointed. And I think that's, when we talk about Mandrake, that's the same thing. We're sort of immediately going from the look from the outset, I'm going to judge this character. And then as we find out, oh no, there's way more to this man that we're presuming. And that in turn is the weapon. And Mandrake knows that about us. He plays into it.
And I think one of the things that struck me watching it a second time is that when you're in control, as much as you could call Mandrake and Tubbs in control, there isn't much cause for them to raise their voices. Whereas Jill and Hoagie are obviously out of control, quite literally. And it's interesting how raised voices from a fear point of view turn into, in Hoagie's case, raised voices from a needing to defend himself because now he's frightened of the truth. He's not frightened of the situation. He's frightened of what he's never admitted. And that makes him raise his voice as well. But no time, even though you could argue that Mandrake and Tubbs have got every reason to be angry at the world about everything they should be shouting their heads off, they've obviously shouted themselves out. So that kind of base anger doesn't exist anymore. So what they have is just a seething attitude to everything around them. So there's no point getting excited about it because it never did them any good in the past.
No, exactly. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, these are men who have been probably screaming inside for 30 years. And they've gone through every hell imaginable and they've become calloused to that. They've become used to that is what life is, that is what's to be expected. But when, you're obviously somebody, if you're somebody like Hoagie or Jill, you believe in civility and things like that. But and also too, I mean, and I've learned this from bad directors actually, who I'm very grateful for having in the past as an actor.
Yeah.
Because I've learned the most is just like people who yell usually, for control are you're playing your hand, you're revealing that you have no control.
If you turn up to 11, you can only stay at 11. You can't.
Exactly. But when I think about the bullies in life or the ones who have been the most insidious people who I've met, they've always been very measured. They don't need to flex those muscles. It's right down here. It's personal. It's invasive. Now
we've been talking about 25 minutes, so I think I can just let people know who are listening that I'm going to ask a question now that is going to have to give some spoilery away because it's about the nature of how you tell the story, and I'm just fascinated to know, in terms of the way that you tease us into the truth that reveals, and I don't mean for you to give us everything about it, but what do you remember being the sort of hardest element of the backstory you're bringing into the present to hold off and how and to get that timing right in terms of the situation and the journey we're on? Which element of Hoagie's truth was the hardest to sort of suppress? Because it would have been easy to tell everything in the first minute if you really wanted to, but it had done us no favors.
There's one thing I'm always conscious of, and Eli is we respect the audience, we respect ourselves as audience members. Audiences, it doesn't take much before the detective is putting all the clues together and moving forward. Just the sheer amount of viewing that we've had and exposure to these kinds of stories. So as soon as you get a sense of like, okay, these guys have met before, we're already, even subconsciously already connecting all the possible, avenues. And once you become, it's mentioned that Hoagie's a teacher, it's obviously very quick to jump to conclusions there. And once you mention something like, a boys' home, then, we know what happens there. We've already, connected those dots. So we had to be very, very clear about going, whatever we put on the table, once it's there, the audience is going to then jump 10 steps ahead of us. So it's also about drip feeding but also then not trying to, you're trying to make sure that you're drip feeding the right amount at the right time, because the audience is going to figure it out, and not hang on those notes. Just leave it in the air unanswered, like as Mandrake does. Oh, good, I've given you enough to know that our paths have crossed. I'm not going to tell you who I was.
Yeah. I mean, because Hoagie's first sort of suspicion is I didn't tell you I was a teacher, and so you're like, So then suddenly we as an audience who've been shocked by the opening bit by the lake are suddenly like, oh my God, he must know him in some way, shape, or form, but we don't know how. No, I just thought that. I mean, I don't want to spoil any more than that, but I think that's, for me, is the magic of the film, is the way that you draw us into that drama without needing to nail it early doors. It's much more fun to allow us to stew on it as much as Jill is stewing on it. And then, I mean, one of my favorite bits in the film is where Jill's gone on this horrible journey of obviously what's happened to her children, and then what she now knows about her husband. And the husband is looking for support. And all you do is you show him trying to shove his hand down the back of a chair, and she doesn't give him any comfort, or he doesn't get the solace he was seeking. And you're like, Jesus, even out of this scenario, their relationship has not survived. I mean, not that it should.
Yeah, I mean, she's got to be. I mean, making Jill active was one thing, because in the short story, she's fine, but ultimately she's a victim, and that's, she cries, she screams, she wails, she gets she gets discarded, and we're very adamant, in putting that sketch together. We actually based Jill on my wife.
Oh, right.
A bit. Whenever we got stuck, we'd go, well, we can imagine, but what would you do? And Debbie, would have checked out, long ago. But it was that thing of going like, how do we make somebody the fourth member of this quartet who has nothing to do with the past? How do we activate them in a meaningful way about, how they're starting to relate and be involved in this mystery of how, things got to this point in this strange meeting. And she's a character who, as we said earlier, we've got to be in her shoes. We want to be seeing the world through her perspective. And what does it mean for a mother to have endured what happens to her? Because in some way it has to do with the man that she married, and now you're learning that the man you married, you're learning about another layer to him, and she's got to be suffering, these terrible losses along the way, but also she's got to take her life and her choices into her own hands too. That was also it's fantastically done. It's a really enjoyable aspect of they're both victims of the drifters, but she's like a victim of the truth much more than Hoagie is, who's the man who's sort of held on to it. And that gives her the power too. So that's why she can challenge Mandrake in the way she does. And I think I think he genuinely, he has to control her, obviously. He has to control everything in his life. But, I think there's probably he says, I can see why you married her. When she makes her a big move, as it were, he pays her a compliment to the husband, doesn't he? It's like it's kind of like it's quite human, that moment, even though it's quite desperate in terms of their overall bad mission they're on. Thinking of how it looks and feels, and I've already mentioned Kiss Me Deadly, which I feel like you've made a proper neo-noir in the way that you've done it. You've given us ordinary people. You've given us the idea that the game is rigged and that the only way to beat the system is to do wrong. All those elements which are brilliant, all the tools of a noir. But we obviously start off, not that noir only exists in the nighttime, but obviously we start in the day and then we drive through the night, obviously the title being a big clue in that.
But obviously they're two different challenges. And I think, I mean, it may have just been the circumstances today when you shot, but I thought that it being an overcast day and a bit blustery means it wasn't, even though they are the perfect family, it wasn't the perfect day by any stretch of the imagination. And in some senses, that made, because I've not been to that part of the world, it made what you showed us actually stand on its own 2 feet, because the sun can make any place look half beautiful. But on an overcast, blustery day, when those when they're going down in that the grass covered canyon and stuff, you really feel the size of New Zealand as a landscape. And then obviously once we leave the lake and we go off on the drive in the dark, that's a whole different other challenge. So I just wondered, what was the conversations like between you and Matt Henley in terms of that kind of contrasting cinematography and how they both bled into each other, I suppose?
No, Matt's great. And I mean, this was Matt's first feature film. We'd together over 8 short films to develop a working relationship together. And, you know, he's a real integral creative partner for me. The thing we were very clear on in terms of the overall intentions of this film, exists between night and day. It's, for me, that's the thematic of it, that's the look of it, that's the characters. Everyone is inhabiting this grey space. And we were really clear about we didn't want to present landscapes in New Zealand. You know, we didn't want to go down that Lord of the Rings.
You weren't doing visitnewzealand.com, were you?
No. In fact, I'm positive the Department of Tourism will never get me to direct any of their commercials after this film. But it's that sense of we wanted to go. Where are those environments that are both beauty, where beauty exists, but also there's also that sense of potential danger or threat to them. And to me, that's the real New Zealand. Yeah. So I think, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But for me, the feeling of you can be in those bright, big, open spaces, and they can turn on a dime. You can suddenly feel very isolated. The land, the whenua is indifferent to what happens on it.
Yes, of course. Yeah, nature doesn't give a shit, does it?
No, and that was very much. It was a different landscape in the short story, but that sentiment that Owen Marshall had in there about horrible things happening against the backdrop of great beauty, it was something that we were always looking for, and we just took it a step further by going, well, what are those landscapes that we have a relationship to? So all around, a lot of those places that were found by our location scout, David Goldthorpe, he did a really great job. Those are actually places that, Matt and I had some familiarity with from our childhood. Those big coast lines, which we like, and those sort of desolate-looking hills and places. So we were very clear about what tone we wanted to capture in that landscape and where we wanted to have the picnic in particular. So yeah, grey, windy, beautiful, but also you wouldn't want to be out there, once it starts to get dark as well. And then the flip side being you go into that nocturnal New Zealand. And I remember this from, our childhood, those big long drives at night to, go see relatives or whomever. And you look out and you're going through like the desert road and it's just black and just you're in a void. Every now and then you go through these small towns, which, depending what the hour is, lights are on, but very few, but there's no one on the streets. There's nothing's open. It's sort of this very alone time, this isolated feeling.
Yeah, because Britain just doesn't have anything to compare. You're about 20 miles from anywhere, and most of it's lit with street. If you go on a road with no street lighting, it's a surprise.
Yeah, but even then, this is sort of, we haven't factually based it in any specific, grounded in a specific place in New Zealand, but it is that sense that you can be in a spot that feels like it's full of life, urban or other rural, but pending that time of night that you go through, they can be just as empty as each other. and that sense of isolation, which was important.
Did you use the real car, or did you have a kit to shoot the car scenes in, as it were?
Yeah, no, we had both. So we had 2 Range Rovers, the most temperamental divas on the set were the 2 cars. We basically had one for the studio interiors. So we shot all the interiors of the car scene in a room probably maybe twice the size of this. It was the most beta lo-fi version of shooting interiors, because we just couldn't afford the time. We shot the film in 20 days, 29, I should say. So it was at breakneck speed, and to try and do a rig, so
is that why then that the use of the real interesting angle choices for close-ups within the car, is that kind of so you can be so precise about what we're looking at?
Partly, I had always sort of felt like if we're going to be in that car, what I want to get the feeling of what it would be like to be under this kind of interrogation and pressure in that confined space. So it was very much about that first and foremost. But what we did want to do was make sure that we were giving, the actors as much environment to react to. So we had, we had a wind system from a fan, with a pipe going in and coming through the cracks of the windows. So you just get that little bit of movement in the hair or in the eyes, rather than, we looked at a lot of car commercials, and, you see those, and they've got these big setups, and the driver's just driving along. It's just like the body's completely disengaged. They're not really in a car. Even though we had the pressure of having to fake it all, we wanted to give the actors as much of a visceral environment as possible, just so you get that little look to the side that they don't have to manufacture. It's a real look.
I can only be like a test crowd of one, but I never got the sense that we weren't moving all the time. So hats off to you in that sense. It felt like a real car journey to me.
Yeah, it was a real DIY. We had plates. We had, but this was done. We shot the plates. We projected them on a $200 projector onto a black curtain and turned the contrast way up. So you got the sort of little black outlines of things moving. And again, it's just giving you that sense of there's just things happening around the environment, that the environment is alive in some way. And it's just going with that. And it's because we're with the actors, because this is what's in shot most of the time.
I like that rhythm of the 4 people being the shot each time. And the only let up was we went and looked out of the windscreen and looked at the headlights on the road. So there was you got the sense that there was nothing out there. So even being out the car, there's nothing, you're not missing anything. But obviously that only adds to I guess as a reflection of you having to drive back from a relative's house on a Sunday, that would just be a boring when are we getting home mum kind of thing. But obviously in the situation you've placed us in, that claustrophobia and boredom becomes a whole different thing altogether. We talked about the writing of it, and obviously then you shot the movie, and then when you're putting it together in the edit, what was revealed about your initial ideas that you began to change in the edit that wasn't obvious when you were writing it, as it were?
I had an amazing editor, Annie Collins, work on this with, and Annie's done everything from Lord of the Rings to Out of the Blue. She's a real legend here in New Zealand. And I learned a lot from Annie. It was like being in a film school. And this is my first short film, my first feature film. And so you spend all this time getting it ready to then move into the edit. And as I've been assured happens for most filmmakers, you go and watch that assembly edit for the first time in a theatre, and you just watch this whole thing and it's just dead. I was just like, this is going on and on and on, and I was sure it was like 3 hours. And at the end of it, there was this sort of silence. I turned around to Annie and I said, "How long was that?" And she said, "That was 91 minutes." And it was like, I can't talk about this today. I'm in too much shock. I'd like to come back tomorrow and watch it again. So we did that. And then it was more of a case of, so I give myself 24 hours of grieving and then come back and went like, okay, right, now I've got a clear idea of what it is that we're dealing with. Let's go into that. And what we did over the course of a few months, Annie and I, was that we looked and went, what can we pull back on and in terms of dialogue or other more orchestrated moments, and where can we just develop tension more by hanging on those faces, lingering looks, really focusing on the moment where you think something is going to be said or happen, because that's where the tension is really the thickest, rather than, because I think we ended up losing a lot of dialogue. Actually, there was a lot that, went out the window, and yet it still feels, Mandrake is still very garrulous through the whole thing. So it was a case of going like, oh, right, less is more. We have got lots of stuff, but actually we can, even at this stage, even though it felt right on the day and the scenes themselves are great, it's just like, we don't need it. And it was just being very diligent in how we pair back so that the potency of what's happening between the characters in the moment is stronger. And once we did that, it actually came together. It's the film that I had imagined, obviously, in my head, but not the one that I saw before the shoot. So it's very much leaning into those intentions that we wanted, but being really ruthless about how do we make them as economic and sharp as possible.
Can you give a scene example of where you had the sort of a lot of dialogue took up the scene, and then you pared it down, and then what you're left with is as few words as you need, but obviously plus the atmosphere of holding on a face? Or
there was a lot more dialogue in that initial run of questioning where Hoagie arrives at the conclusion of, I never said I was a teacher. And it was, what followed on from there, I think it's just before they land at the gas station.
Right.
That had a lot more. And obviously that's the first big scene. So it was, we were also conscious of length and everything like that.
Yeah.
That was just a case of going, we cut to Jill a lot there. We see her eyes sort of like things are starting to land in her in the conversation.
I love that aspect of her where she's almost, you're getting her penny drop, but she doesn't actually know what penny's about to drop yet, but she knows it's not going to be good.
So I'm a big fan of going, just because you're saying the line or you're the person who's meant to be hearing the line doesn't mean we should be on either of you. It's about what's being said is affecting the whole. And we did find we're getting the potency of what's being revealed more through Jill or Tubbs, actually, because Tubbs, who we haven't really talked about too much, he's in the dark about this as well, really. He's not as far ahead in terms of the plan as Mandrake is. He's much more reactive. So you're seeing, you're starting to see how this moment, this revelation is starting to unfold, but how it's going to affect other people as well, not just those two men, Hoagie and Mandrake. I think, it's about going, this is something I encourage the actors too. It's just like, it's all up for grabs. If you can fight for the camera to be looking at you without getting outside of the scene or doing something, that's going to damage the scene, that can, you've got to be following the story still, the intended story and the beat. You need to be, constantly on, because, and we shot different scenes at different times of just going, we'll just leave that, we'll start here, but let's drift over and watch what Matthias is doing. And see what's revealed there.
But I mean, that was one thing that I noted again it's the second watch where I saw this more, is in the same way that you make Jill's involvement active, the sort of opening up of Tubbs as a character who's also in this dilemma and this predicament as much as Hoagie, because I'm guessing from the way it starts off before the name of Hoagie is revealed, they would have just been left there to wait until they'd gone away. They weren't gonna die, I'm guessing.
Well, in my mind, they would have just all been put down.
Okay. Because I took the kind of name dropping bit as being why the first two get killed, and it's like, and we take them with us. I just thought they weren't going to do it. I don't know why I didn't. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's something, I think that's very callous about, like New Zealand or any other places. We've got a long history of, especially in the 80s and 90s of, backpackers go hitchhiking, they're robbed, and they're needlessly executed.
Right.
Just
okay.
That sort of, I never think when I think of Tubbs, it's never something. I think it's something that he endures. I don't think he has a need to do that, as opposed to Mandrake, which is it's all about control and power.
But you give us. But I mean, I can't imagine it was on page one. But tell me if it was, because in the film you give us Tubbs at the start of the film. You silhouette him against the hill, and you end him silhouetted against the hill. So. And I must admit, the first time I didn't see that, and I was like, I was really arrested by it this first time around. I'm going, oh, why? And I'd made a note of like, oh, who was that? And obviously, I've got to wait a long time before I get the answers to what that moment was, because it definitely is not directly linked to the opening sequence. So it was kind of jarring. But you pay it off, and it's beautifully done.
And you're right. I mean, that wasn't on the page. That was the first image we had was the second shot of the film, which is the abandoned Mercedes side of the page. And Annie sort of suggested looking at how it's the invitation is with the car is fine. It's a little languid. It's how can we sort of make something more thematically a statement?
Well, in a way, it personalised the abandoned car in a way, because you've got the silhouetted, for me, you've got the silhouetted figure, and I'm thinking, well, there must be a link between the silhouetted figure and the abandoned car. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the person whose car's been robbed off them, or they're the one that's robbed it. You don't know that at that point, but you definitely personalise it, as opposed to, because an abandoned car could look like could just be a dystopia. We see abandoned cars all the time.
That's a great way of putting it, personalising it, because I mean, we wanted to start with an image of which there was a level of obscurity to it and mystery to it. So automatically, we're trying to get people going like, where are we going with this? What is this? And it also came from this notion of because Tubbs up on that hill, looks like a little kid. Really, it could be a little. You don't know anything. And I'm always struck by, I remember speaking to one of the guys who I met through, doing the documentary about being in a boys' home. And this guy's a very big, burly, intimidating gorilla of a man. And he's since had his settlement with the government, and he's had compensation for what's happened to him. But I always remember him saying, the problem when I talk about these things that have happened to me and trying to get some acknowledgement is people only see the man, they see the tats, they see the size, they see the criminal. They don't see that what I'm talking about is what happened to the 10-year-old boy in the man. And that's how I always that's how I saw Tubbs, and that's the quality that Matthias brings to the role, is that, how can we actually see the boy in the man? Because that's what we're talking about.
No, it's lovely.
So I love that idea of, this little sort of, is that a kid? What's he doing on the beach? And then at the end, we obviously have an understanding of who that is and what that means. And that felt like a really great way to, bookend and keep on thematic.
Without a doubt. No, it works a treat. Given you did so much work with people directly affected with it, how was their response? How did you find their response to what you'd done with their stories and their experiences that they'd shared with you?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't. There's a couple of the only things that we have referred to that were specifics and things that actually happened came from one particular person, a good friend of mine, Keith, and so he gave us permission to he advocated for it. Keith's very he's been very instrumental with the Royal Commission here, and we've developed a really good friendship. So he's very much behind the film. So it was very important to go, well, if we're going to talk about specifics, then we need to have permission from that person who happened to. What I found was really fascinating was that after the film came out, a lawyer in Tampa, Florida, contacted me and said, saw the film, loved it. Can I ask, was it inspired by events that happened at a place called Aspen Ranch in the States? And I was like, oh, no. And I read up on this a bit, and he said, because, the scrubbing incident, that happened at Aspen Ranch, a tattoo that got scrubbed by a staff member. And he said, and Hoagie reminded me so much of that staff member who he had been. And I looked on another review on Amazon that just said Aspen Ranch ? And I think what that really speaks to is sort of the banality of evil, the banality of sadism. It doesn't take, to me, it takes a lack of imagination, and it's no surprise that these kinds of things happen on both sides of the globe at different places at different times. When people commit acts of cruelty, it's very easy to be cruel. It's not a stretch of the imagination. So I found that really fascinating and very, it was very sad actually. But again, if that is, tapped into something that, helps talk, the effects of what's happened at places like Aspen Ranch or the schools that we talk about and Coming Home in the Dark, I think that's a positive thing. But if anything, the person I was most concerned about their opinion of the film wasn't Owen, wasn't my mum and dad. wasn't anyone. It was Keith and a couple of the other people who've been involved.
Yeah. I imagine there's a lot of pressure there.
And it was great to have, their blessing in the first place, but also just their response on opening night. Keith was there sitting next to the Deputy Prime Minister, who knew about his own journey as well, and to have that sort of acknowledgement from people who have lived through that experience. Of course, this is a fiction; it's drawing from real life inspirations, yes. But the fact that and in Keith's words, it's that thing of going. It's now documented. It's now in record, and it's now getting to that audience that is actually hard for to engage with through the courts and the news. It's getting to an audience to get them thinking in a little more open and empathetic, hopefully, to the rather ugly, side of our social and cultural history here in New Zealand. So that meant a lot.
I imagine. I mean, I think one of the lines that Jill says, I think you really open up the conversation about these kind of things with the difference between doing it and letting it happen is a thing, but they live on the same street. I thought that was a brilliant way of encompassing the wrong and the wrong. There's no right and wrong here. They're just wrong and wrong.
Absolutely. And I think, that's the reason why we met a little bit of pressure early on in the with the script about Hoagie, people feeling like, no, Hoagie needs to have done something. He needs to have committed a much stronger, irredeemable, unforgivable act to warrant what is happening to him and his family. And we were always very clear of going, no, because the moment we do that, the moment you make somebody a pedophile, say, if his character had been that, or a sexual abuser, as an audience member, I think we're immediately able to divorce ourselves then.
Absolutely.
We're able to go, that's not me. That is not, that is one bridge too far. So I'm out. Where if we make them complicit in going, well, are we not all standing by and watching and allowing things to happen? Then we're not letting you off, and therefore you're in the story more, whether you agree with that or not.
This is about power, and I think institutional power has a very strong effect on people's good and bad decisions, and it clearly takes a very, very strong person who might be at the start of what career they've just spent 5 years studying to turn around and go, oi, whoa, this isn't how you do it.
Absolutely. And it's that thing of going, we've all turned a blind eye in the, playground as children to, a bully taking, victimizing some other poor kid, and you're just kind of grateful it's not happening to you. So you don't go, these are all the sort of beginnings, and they're very human flaws too, which we should acknowledge and not necessarily, be punitive about. But it's about going, it's still a choice, and how do we make those choices earlier to stand up, and also how do we have some empathy for people like Hoagie, who in going like, that is a hard situation, that is a tough situation, because most of the people I've met and interviewed who really went into those places to do good, either they checked out early because it's just like, this is too big for me, or that they've moved through the ranks in some way to try and get involved with policy and influence in affecting change rather than being on the front.
Now, one last question then. Given it was your first feature, your directorial debut on a feature, and you've obviously made a number of shorts leading up to that, and a 20-day shoot must have been a bloody whirlwind for you. What do you recall as, like, not necessarily a fond memory, and it can be a fond memory by all means, but just one of those things where you kind of like that fist clenching, yes, we did it, when it kind of, in the run up to it and you knew it was in the schedule, and you were thinking, how the shit are we going to do that? Was there anything you remember of the shoot where it was like something you knew was going to be a challenge, and it was such a joy to overcome it? Sort
of looking back at it now, and I'm not being facetious, every single bloody day of production, shoot, and post was literally, after a while it started to feel funny, because it's just like, I know you expect challenges in a film, but it feels like I'm literally have the list of all the challenges that can happen. I'm just checking them off as it goes. But the best thing about that, and the thing I enjoyed and felt most confident in, was going, these aren't my sole problems to be burdened with. These are the challenges. This is making a film. This is what it's not a problem. It's the actual craft of making a film, and how you rally around and relieve yourself of having to have all the answers, for one, and start utilizing the strength and the skills in the team around you to be part of and bring them into the challenge. I mean, obviously there's, as a director, there's an accountability with, aspects of the film, and you have to make the tough decisions, sure. But you've got these great people around you who have worked on everything from Avatar to Lord of the Rings to student short films. Bring them into the challenge and arm yourself with them, and lean on them, and explore, get curious, get interested, throw the problem to other people, to the Apollo 13 process of being around the table, where you've got all the experts going, well, if we do this will be the side effect of that, and the next person goes, yeah, but if we do that, so we might need to do this to get around that aspect. And then it becomes alive. It becomes not just pleasurable and fun, because that's the exciting part of filmmaking, I think, is in those challenges and discoveries. But it also imbues everyone with a focus and a drive to come up with solutions. So this aspect of the hair moving through the car window that I wanted for the actors, that was solved by the sound team. Because it was most important for the sound team, because they don't want some whirring fan or something coming from. So they actually found a way to do it where it was done silently and things like that. So it was about going like, yeah, you've got a job to do, and we're not wanting to load you up with extra, problems to solve outside of that. But this is something that affects what you have to do. So you will be coming to it with a whole bunch of perspectives on that others won't be thinking.
So it's a bit. So instead of feeling as that first time director, I've got to make a film, you try to keep hold of we're making a film as a kind of central, as almost like a dogmatic point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, I think this just comes from the fact that I come from a theatre background too. We did a lot of devised work, which was where the lines of designer, writer, director, performer all start to get blurred. So I think Eli and I, we're lucky that we have that in our repertoire. But look, I mean, I'm the arbiter of taste on the thing,
of course,
and I have a very clear idea of what I'm looking for and the feeling going for. But it's about making sure everyone understands what that is, and give them the space to do their job to the best of their capabilities. It's I've known a few directors who it sounds like it's a pretty lonely job sometimes. And the best thing about this is just it wasn't lonely at all. Even in those like the edit suite when it's just two people, it was always front of mind. How do I allow people to do their job to the best possible of their capabilities, and provide an outcome that they're proud of? And generally, if I can do that, they're simultaneously, usually they're hitting the note of what the feeling of my vision or the intention of the vision is at any given moment. I think there's a really strong alignment between those two aspects of filmmaking. I think you really have to trust yourself and you have to trust your crew to do that. But it's important to induct people in the right way into that vision. Be very clear about what your intention is. Make sure that they understand it from.
No, indeed. I mean, look, in a way, there's kind of leadership 101, isn't it? In a way, it's like you can't assume people know exactly what's in your head, so you're better off trying to tell them some of it.
And it amazes me how that's something that seems to never be taught.
Leadership and networking are the two things that don't seem to get taught on filmmaking courses, and you'd think it's one of the two biggest aspects of like once you get control of anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate that I've learned that from being on sets as an actor. I've had a lot of time. I had been on film sets since I was 15, so I've seen it at its best and at its worst too. So that's by osmosis I've learned it. So it was great to be leading that.
Well, look, congratulations on Coming Home in the Dark. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully that's come across in the conversation we've had. People can watch that on Netflix, as we said at the beginning. And it just gives me to say thank you very much for giving us your time on the Britflicks podcast.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, Stuart. Thank you.